Hello and welcome, I'm Olas Gerjuk and you're watching Head to Head with UATV. On April 22nd, the observation mission from the Ukrainian World Congress confirmed that the presidential election in Ukraine were democratic and met international standards. To talk more about the assessment of the second round, we are joined in the studio today by Eugene Czolij, head of the Ukrainian World Congress International Observation Mission to Ukraine's 2019 elections. Hello and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, Olish.
It's a pleasure to have you here. So let's start our discussion. Speaking of this, statement that the Ukrainian elections met international standards, was this the preliminary assessment, or is this the final statement of the UWC?
Well, we made preliminary observations in the sense that we make a final comment once all the information is out and the CEC, the Central Election Commission, announces the results. But the fact that these elections were democratic and that they met international standards is definitely going to stay in the final report.
Nice. Well, the UWC mission is the third largest international observation mission to Ukraine's elections. You had almost 250, right, observers working at the polling stations throughout Ukraine. So what can you tell us about the second round?
Let me just tell you that we had actually more than 250. We had 250 from the Ukrainian World Congress, but together with our member organization, the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, we actually had 337 short-term observers, and we have 122 long-term observers that are doing media monitoring at distance. What I can say about the second term or the second round of the elections is that they were incredible elections from our perspective, historic elections, in that Ukraine had to face tremendous challenges in order to conduct such elections, starting with the Russian hybrid aggression, the military aggression in eastern Ukraine, the illegal occupation of Crimea, the situation in the Russian Federation, which forced the Central Election Commission to close all polling stations in the Russian Federation. To obviously, Ukrainian citizens could not vote in occupied territories in the Donbass and Crimea, and many real and pseudo experts predicted that these elections would be problematic, chaotic. At the end of the day, the governing authorities and the enforcement agencies have been able to ensure a democratic process. They have addressed the issue of Ukrainians that are living in the occupied territories, in facilitating for them to be able to change the electoral precinct and vote in another precinct if that was their choice. For Ukrainian citizens living in the Russian Federation, they were able to vote in diplomatic missions in Kazakhstan and Finland and Georgia.
And Georgia. So there were some solutions.
So there were solutions that were found, and the security was ensured. For instance, I think that the security issues must have been a tremendous challenge during the debate at the stadium, but the whole process was
amount of people
exactly. So the whole process had superb challenges, and I think the Ukrainian authorities came through and ensured that the Ukrainian electorate was able to vote in a democratic election. And the fact that we had an over 60% turnout during the first round, and that number increased to 62%, indicates that the Ukrainian electorate is believing in the electoral system in Ukraine, which is a tremendous step forward in democracy building in Ukraine.
This is actually a really historic moment for Ukraine, maybe some kind of twisting moment that Ukraine is shifting onto this real democracy, practical democracy, democracy in practice, instead of just populist statements that Ukraine aims to become a democratic and a state with European values and Western values. Because these elections were the most transparent, probably the most democratic ones in Ukraine's history, and they have been held in the conditions of war. So this is the phenomena.
I would fully agree with your statement to the effect that we are not in terms of the election, it's not just a question of becoming more democratic. I think Ukraine has attained the level of democracy that Western countries have, at least in terms of the electoral process, both during the campaign and election day. And for that, the Ukrainian World Congress congratulates the Ukrainian authorities for having not only paid lip service to democratic values, but actually to have ensured them.
This is a very positive aspect. And let's also discuss the negative one. What about the violations? There have been around 1,000 cases, right, during the second round. Could you please tell us about them?
I think that the violations from both what our short-term observers have been able to pick up and other missions are minor. For instance, one of the things that we've pointed out is that people that are either elderly or disabled at times in certain precincts had to go up 2 flights of stairs in order to vote. Those are issues that obviously still need to be remedied, but by and large, the violations or infractions were minor, certainly did not affect the result of the vote. And I would venture to say that pretty much in any country, observers will be able to pick up violations of the electoral process. Human error is obviously exists, and it exists in all spheres, including during an electoral process. So I would certainly, for those elections, not concentrate on the violations because they were minor and certainly had no impact on the results.
Mm-hmm. So the violations that were observed by the international observers from the UWC were mostly regarding the accessibility of the polling stations to ordinary people, to the voters. Well, I want to discuss just one more aspect. Mm-hmm. According to Opora Civil Network, the most frequent violation was the fact of handing ballots without issuing the necessary documents. So I wanted to ask about the experience of the observers from the UWC. How are these incidents happening? How is this possible that somebody can issue the ballot to a person who doesn't have a passport? I mean, maybe the passport, the international passport, but not the passport of the citizen of Ukraine.
Yeah, I think that the way I would answer that question is that, as I've said earlier, human error exists. It exists in all spheres, and that's probably the best explanation I can give. Yeah. That probably somebody who was issuing the ballot was giving the ballot to vote without having properly checked the documents. That happens. It happens here. It happens in other countries.
Mm-hmm. How could you compare the first and the second round of these presidential elections in terms of quantity and volume of violations, and also in terms of ensuring peace by the law enforcement bodies?
I think that both the first and second round of voting and the campaign that preceded both were by and large, in terms of violations and in terms of democracy, about at the same level. I think that most of the preliminary observations from not only the Ukrainian World Congress, but other observation missions at the end of the first round and second round came pretty much to the same results, that they picked up a certain number of infractions and issues that needed to be improved, but by and large that in both cases the elections were fair, democratic, and met international standards for such elections.
Mm-hmm. Well, the observations of the Ukrainian World Congress, I know, are much broader than just the procedure of voting. You are following the whole process and issued a few recommendations in your report in regard of political campaigns, debates, the day of silence, when no political advertisement is allowed, and access of candidates to mass media. Could you please tell us about these recommendations?
Yeah, just I'd like to mention that when you were saying that we have a more encompassing mission, I just wanted to comment that the Ukrainian World Congress, together with our member organization, the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, actually monitors the elections not only in Ukraine, but we've monitored in 25 countries in the world the voting that went in various diplomatic missions of Ukraine in the world. So those are the only two missions that actually monitor that process in order to have a comprehensive review and reporting on and monitoring of integrity of the process. In terms of our recommendations, I think that we're obviously in the final report we'll give a very comprehensive list of recommendations. But what we've already indicated is that we, in view of the fact that a lot of attention was put around the issue of the debate, that we found it rather surprising that a debate was provided in the legislation to be held a couple of hours before the day of silence. From our perspective, a debate should be held at least 1 week before the voting, in order to ensure that once the debate is completed, that experts, civil society
could discuss
the debate, exactly, and not for the debate to be concluded and a couple of hours later for the day of silence to kick in, and obviously the following day for it to be the voting day. The second issue is that from our perspective, the day of silence is no longer necessary. It certainly does not take into account today's reality. I don't think it's that important whether a billboard outside of Kyiv where 3 cars pass is important, whether it's there or not the day before the elections. When I can have on Facebook about 5,000 friends and can communicate from outside of Ukraine information and recommendation as to who to vote, and that certainly would have a much bigger impact than a billboard.
And it had impact because there was a big drama on Facebook, as always.
Yeah, and somebody, for instance, from Canada that would be making a comment on Facebook would certainly not be violating the day of silence, because Canadians are social media, and social media, as you know, has no boundaries, and that is why, from our perspective, in today's reality, this is no longer effective and no longer needed. The other issue is that when we've reviewed the legislation, although that did not happen, technically, if somebody would have used or probably misused the judicial process, one could have ended up in a situation where the second round of elections will be held on the same day that the courts would be deciding who should be in the second round. We think that that needs to be corrected in order to ensure that that never happens. And the other recommendation that you've mentioned is for there to be equal time and equal representation before mass media of the candidates that run for the position of president. It's probably it's certainly more challenging when you have 39 candidates to ensure equal time to all. But at least during the second round, when you have 2 candidates, I think that all mass media should be giving equal and uniform representation of the candidates. One final issue.
Another thing is that some media outlets have been very biased in this presidential election.
That's why in our recommendation, we said both equal time and uniform representation in order to address that it's not just a question of, for instance, giving both candidates an hour and giving a superbly positive review of one candidate and
very negative of the other one.
Yes, so we think that it should be objective and give an equal and uniform representation in terms of timing and objectivity. And one last issue that we will be addressing, but we did not yet announce it, but we'll certainly do it in the final report, is how to facilitate the voting for Ukrainian citizens living outside of Ukraine in order for them, especially those that live at a great distance from a diplomatic mission, for them to be able to exercise their right to vote. I think that Ukraine has moved in terms of democracy tremendously forward. There's a bigger trust in the system, and I think that
voting online, maybe.
That's why I'm saying I think we're getting to that point where voting online is something that would be acceptable. Voting online can only be done if there is trust in the system. I think we are heading in that direction.
Well, thank you very much for these broad recommendations, and I hope that the Ukrainian authorities will take them into account. Unfortunately, we ran out of time, but thank you for this valuable information that you shared with us.
Thank you very much for having me on this again.
Thank you. That was Eugene Czolij, head of the Ukrainian World Congress International Observation Mission to Ukraine's 2019 elections. Thank you for watching Head to Head. I'm Oles Garjuk. Goodbye.